Folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk sort of generically about the goings on in the Middle East now, and everyone's talking about it, and it certainly seems to be one of the most unpleasant incidents or instances and events that we've had for quite some time. Let's have a look at that, and let's also consider the outrageous misreporting and the terrible lies. You know, once any society manages to detach itself from reality, then any lie, any untruth, no matter how grotesque, becomes acceptable. And that's where we are now in the world. You know, the globalists have brought us here, and this is where things are at. But I want to talk not only about some of the background about how modern Israel came to be, but some of the origins of the conflict. And it's like often, like many things like this, it's extremely nuanced. The idea, I mean, we seem to get two versions from the propaganda machine. One is there's a good and there's a bad. That's it. There's a good and a bad in the story, which makes it easy, I guess, for people to digest. Then there's the secondary propaganda campaign, which is, look, it's so confusing. We just don't know. Badness everywhere. Badness. Oh, who's to blame? Who can tell? Who knows? And therefore, there's no attempt to actually come to grips with the facts or any of the realities of the situation. A situation which, by the way, is nuanced and is unpleasant and so on. So, I guess in looking at this, we need to look at the build-up to the modern state of Israel. And I'll pick a sort of, if you like, an arbitrary or random beginning point, say, immediately following World War One, when there was a lot of a lot of talk about boundaries all over the place and changing national boundaries and rewriting boundaries. And there was, I think, a genuine attempt on the part of some of the people around Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, to try and draw up national boundaries that would limit or make unnecessary things like conflict over borders or over national self-determination and so on. So the Jewish diaspora, dealt themselves into this game. Well, hey, hold on. If we're talking about borders, then why don't we talk about a state of Israel? So I'll use that as a state. We could go back earlier, by the way. There were a lot of. I just want to sort of also make people seem to be confused over what Zionism is. It's the idea of a Jewish homeland, like a national identity or national homeland for Jews. So Jews that support the idea of a Jewish state for Jewish people. So Zionism. And some people confuse or conflate that with other aspects of the Jewish diaspora. Now, there was a number of pogroms in Russia in the between 1860 and sort of around 1895, I guess, and it went on beyond that. When I say Russia, it includes, Russia and also what were referred to as the day back in the time of, this is the time of the Tsars, the aristocracy, of all the Russias. And that meant Ukraine, Belarus, and Eastern Poland, which was at that time occupied by Russia. And now, there were a lot of Jews in Belarus, Ukraine, and Eastern Poland. There was a very large number of Jews, relative to other areas of the world. So in these pogroms, the Russians kicked out a lot of or made life miserable enough that the Jews wanted to leave. And a lot of them at that time, went to the United States and settled in around the Northeast there, particularly around New York and so on. So, this is where the rump, if you like, of the Jewish diaspora came from. I had breakfast with a Russian Jewish guy in, I think it was Philadelphia. This is some years ago now. And bear in mind, he's sort of third generation Jewish, I think, born in the US, if not fourth. But where it somehow came up in conversation about the Russian pogroms, and I think his folks or his lineage, came over to the United States in I think it was the early 1860s, as I recall. And yet, as he began telling me about it, or even mentioning it, about the Russians coming to the United States from, I think he was like originally Ukrainian or something, as indeed was Leon Trotsky. And then he started to cry. This is in the fucking restaurant having breakfast. He was crying about his great grandfather's journey from there to. So this is sort of how deeply held in sort of folklore it was, and his mention was, had there been a Jewish homeland had Israel existed, then he believes at least his forebears would have gone there. So they were in the United States under sufferance, and indirectly Gentiles everywhere have to pay for and must be made to pay for that suffering that his forebears had. Now, given how well he was doing, like he's got a Jewish wife and Jewish kids going to a Jewish school, and he was doing pretty good. He's quite a smart guy, actually. Like if you're just looking sort of raw intellect, he was quite a smart guy. And his wife had some high-powered job in finance, so it wasn't like they were on the bones of their ass. Far from it. And he mentioned the fees that his kids' high school charged for places, and you'd had to be doing pretty good just to put the kids through school, let alone paying mortgage or anything. So he was doing all right. So why he would be breaking down in tears over the alleged travails of his great grandparents is quite beyond me. But anyway, there you go. Now, or great grandparents might have been in his case. Now, coming to the this is where the nuance starts to kick in. Now, we've got a pre World War II type of history, or pre sort of 1935 history of the area around where Israel is today in Palestine, the disputed areas. And then we've got a post sort of World War II history. And the two histories are vastly different in how they're told. Now, I don't know if you've noticed that where any mention of Jews or Israel or Jewish related issues today and for quite some time, and certainly since World War II, you can't have a conversation about it. Because all that happens is, and as soon as the mentions of Jews, you cannot utter a fucking sentence, and one cannot be reported in the media that relates to Jewish without fascist Nazi, Hitler, swastika, Holocaust, Nazi Germany, fascist Nazi, Hitler, Holocaust, swastika, Hitler, You cannot have a conversation with that. And I've noticed that every sort of Jewish activist or anyone in the public eye, they will always manage to slip Holocaust into the sentence. They use it sort of indiscriminately, like either they had relatives, so they claim, this is never proven, I don't think, they had relatives that were in the Holocaust. So they'll use in the Holocaust. Now, I know some Hungarian Jews, or a number of Jews, but Hungarian who escaped from Hungary, and they were in Europe at the time of the Holocaust, and this makes them somehow associated with it, even though they were untouched by it. They were never arrested or put in any camp. None of their relatives, nobody they knew was touched or affected by this Holocaust. Yet by merely invoking "I'm Jewish, Holocaust," and they can put that in the same sentence or paragraph, they've instantly changed how they can be treated or held accountable. You can't hold me accountable for anything because I was associated with the Holocaust. You damn fucking Nazi, fucking Hitler, fascist. So they were able to, duck and bob and weave sort of out of that. But again, you can't mention anything about Jewish people without the Holocaust or Hitler or fascist or Nazi coming in, and even the slightest question, like I've noticed that the guys from the ADL and those sort of things, whenever they're questioned or held to account for their utterances, they just go, oh, yeah, well, you're just Hitler. And that gets them off the hook, and they smirk, quite happily. But use that one again, got away with it. But let's come back to history now. Let's have a look at terrorism. Before I go any further, I'm going to read a report in 1948. Now, in 1948, the British had the very unhappy job, by the way, of mandating that area around Palestine, or that wider area, that part of which was to become Israel. And they were walking on a knife edge. They had Arab activists. They had the US government climbing. This is the British had the US government climbing all over them. The Jewish diaspora arm twisting Harry Truman and the American administration generally. The French were also involved in that area, around Syria and so on. They were as nervous as hell about things. There was the Arab oil was increasingly becoming a huge factor in the geopolitics of the world. There were communist agitators all over the place, Jewish activists wanting a homeland, Arab activists that were, and the Arabs themselves were split between, the hardcore, hardline, and very devout Islamists, who were in turn split, Shia and Sunni and all this sort of stuff. And then there was the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the various people. I mean, it was all over the place, and trying to navigate through that was an impossibility. But nonetheless, let's have a look at the Jewish terrorism that was going on at the time. The Jewish activists sort of perceived Britain to be, and the British were, by the way, dithering and backsliding on some of the things they were, some of the undertakings they had supposedly given, and I think mainly because they were getting pushed and hammered from all sides. Now, here's the murder of a British officer and 5 British soldiers, and also the injury of numerous other British soldiers. So here's the report. 7 o'clock in the morning of 6th of April, this is 1948, an armoured scout car and an armoured personnel carrier and a police car and a truck drove into a military camp this is in what would be Israel, and armed Jewish activists dressed in police uniforms and armed British Army uniforms jumped out of the vehicles and lined up the sentries and shot them in the back of the head. This is the British soldiers, the sentries. And they bombed a nearby radio communications room. Various people were injured there. The Jewish activists then drove their vehicles into the centre of the camp. Again, this is the British Army camp, and took up positions from which continuous fire, machine gun fire, was shot into the various surrounding buildings. And under the cover of this fire, which also killed an officer and 2 other soldiers and wounded several others, the Jewish activists attacked the 3 camp armories. The activists withdrew, taking 62 rifles, 38 machine guns, and 18 mounted machine guns, and 4 anti-tank guns, and a quantity of ammunition, and 2 trucks were also taken, but later abandoned. All the attackers have escaped, and they had mined a number of the roads leading out of the camp. This is an outrage. It's a cold-blooded murder for its own sake and nothing else. Senseless crimes committed by the members of a community which aspires to recognition by the world as ready for acceptance into the community of nations. And it continues to blot the record of the Jews in Palestine. They have frequently been condemned for these acts. So there have been multiple acts here by the Jewish activists. By the way, one of the key players in this, I don't know about in that one, but in others, was Menachem Begin, who was a future prime minister of Israel. The authorities will blah, 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 blah. Now there was here's a comment. Winston Churchill weighed into this one. Why was the camp so unprepared? They're in the middle of a hostile sort of situation, and yet they were taken completely by surprise. And how well planned and efficient this operation was, while the British soldiers seemed to have no idea that it was coming or to be prepared for such possibilities. Now, these assassinations and murders of British soldiers, Britain just happened to be the occupying force, but it was an international mandate, and one I don't think the British really wanted. But nonetheless, now within 6 weeks, I think it was, of those and others, the United States government decided to recognise Israel as a state, while Israeli terrorists, Jewish terrorists, were running around, murdering British service personnel. And these service personnel, by the way, were keeping the armed Arabs away from the Jews, so it wasn't like they were standing around doing nothing there, as ineffective as ultimately it may have been, given how easily they were taken, were surprised there. But what was going on after World War I was that there was the idea of creating a Jewish state. Now, to some extent, the Jewish activists, or the Zionists, as they were generically called at the time, and still are, in fact, they were buying up land from the Palestinian absent landholders. So the Arabic, not only Palestinians, but many Palestinians owned some of the land, a lot of the land around there. So say farmland and other land, but they weren't actively employed in, they weren't using the land. They were simply absent landlords. Or not all of them, but many of them were. So what the Jewish Zionists were doing, in what I think was a planned and premeditated sort of fait accompli type takeover move, is they were buying up a land and paying, by the way, premium prices. It wasn't like they were paying knockdown prices or anything. They were buying up the land and owning it. So they owned a lot of the land that would make up, not all of it, but a lot of the land that would make up what is modern day Israel. So they'd owned this land, and they had were moving Jewish people and Jewish families and Jewish agriculturalists, farmers, farm workers, that sort of thing, were moving them into the area, and so were displacing the Arabs to a large extent, and so they became really the dominant population, the dominant landowners in that region. So this was part of, I think, of an organised move by, and it took a lot of money to do this, by the way. When you're buying up farmland like that, or buying up land like that, and paying premium prices, it takes quite a lot of money to do it. So that money was coming through international Jewish finance in what, in my view, was clearly an attempt to begin the agitation and the justification to organise a Jewish state. So, and by the way, which I think is justified. I think the Jews, like anyone else, have the right to a homeland. So I don't think that should be disputed. Where exactly what the boundaries might be, that can be debated, and still is today. So the camps that were involved with this were, well, the British. British and the French, again, very, very sensitive to Arab sensitivities because of the politics of oil, which became even bigger after World War II. The Jews having this huge sort of propaganda advantage over the Holocaust, so they could invoke the Holocaust. Anyone resisted them or disagreed with them, oh yeah, you're Hitler, and so there was that to contend with. But also the multiple Arabic pays. Not all the Arabs agreed on what to do about Israel. Many believed that Israel had no right to exist at all, which made it a tough gig, I guess. Others had a view that Israel could exist, but as if you like an occupied Arab territory, and working on behalf of Arab landowners, and that was never going to fly. Others had different views again. Others believed that once a Jewish state was put in there, it would effectively be if you like, a Trojan horse for American influence peddling. Not a totally ridiculous view, but one that I think was over exaggerated. And saying that, of course, with hindsight now, some of the claims back in the day were truly hysterical over what was happening. But I just want to point out how many parties were involved in the creation of Israel. I believe they had a right to a decisive opinion, sort of really on the front seat of the table, and how just among the Arabic parties alone, there were 4, if not 5, really quite contradictory visions of what whether A, Israel should exist, and B, if it did, how it should be structured and put in place. Then there was the Jewish activists, or those simply wanting a nation state, and there were some quite formidable names back in the time. David Ben-Gurion and others. Menachem Begin, I've mentioned. Golda Meir and so on. David Ben-Gurion was a Polish, or formerly from like Russian Poland, I think it was, and where again there was a very large Jewish diaspora. That was still there, by the way, in the 1930s and 1940s. So he came from there. Golda Meir came from the United States. Begin, I can't remember. But there were other sort of players involved there. And the Jewish people too had their view. Not all the Jewish people believed they should run around killing and assassinating British soldiers. They thought that would be counterproductive ultimately. And would either incur British reprisals, or alternatively, the British would just go, well, screw you then, and leave the the Jews to the tender mercies of the belligerent Arabs. So, which, by the way, is an approximation of what did happen. So these are the now this is where it's sort of all started. Now, so really every attempt at accommodating, whether it be Palestine or the original idea was that Israel and Palestine would coexist as two separate states, but the Arabs themselves couldn't agree on how that would work, let alone the Americans or the British and French or the United Nations or any of these other players. So it was horribly chaotic, really, all the way through, and every determination was made as a compromise expediency in the heat of what was seen as an urgent situation to avoid an even worse conflict beginning. So really there was never, as far as I can tell at least, there's never an attempt to say, okay, what can we do that will solve the problem, assuming it's soluble, of course, it's solvable. Now, if we look at the reporting today, it's more a propaganda extravaganza as the various parties jostle for public relations supremacy in this. So we've got the globalists, and then we've got the Arabic groups, and of course the Israelis. Now we come to an interesting sort of thing at the beginning of this recent conflict, which kicked off a few days ago, where one of the most formidable intelligence organizations in the world, and they would need to be formidable. I mean, they're surrounded by people that don't think well of them. One of the most formidable intelligence agencies in the world was caught completely unawares by what was clearly a very amateurish, no less murderous because it's amateurish, by the way, but a very amateurish effort to get into Israel and start shooting up the town. And why were this very formidable intelligence agency, why were they caught so much by surprise? The second thing is, why were the various security forces near the border and the sort of things where they would be on high alert, you'd think all the time, why they were completely absent? And then thirdly, why they were so slow in mobilizing. Only after the murders and the shootings and whatnot had occurred, and when the propaganda advantage had been established, did they only then decide that they were going to do something about it. So clearly there's a political agenda in the background. I mean, it's very hard not to see this as a globalist setup, but I don't know. Maybe that's getting a little bit carried away. But the issue here is this is simply another development in something that was never properly solved or properly put together, because there were so many parties in disputation over how it should happen, or indeed if it should happen at all. There's still Arabic groups today that think Israel has no, or certainly in its location, has no right to exist. So it's not an easy gig. I'll go back even further here just to sort of round it off. The area of Judea, I think it's called then, was occupied by the Romans, and a bit like the Balkans, the Roman emperors and the administrators despaired of an area that was constantly in a state of unrest. This is before Muhammad had come along some 600 years later. So this was without the Islamic religion even to contend with. There was the ancient Jewish religion, Moses and all that sort of stuff, and there was the more recent Christian religions, or Christian religion, Jesus coming out of that area, which seems, that whole area seems like a hotbed of, like, if you look at, Islam and the Jewish religion, the Christianity, it all sort of seemed to happen in that triangle in the Middle East. But anyway, so the Romans, Roman soldiers and so on, and political officials were constantly being killed by Jewish activists, and the name assassin, really came from that. And the Romans, got to the point of exasperation where they decided, okay, we're going to wipe you all out. That's it. Had enough. Now, this was a hugely expensive exercise, hugely expensive, and one that was going to involve substantial Roman forces and vast resources. So it isn't something the Romans were going to. This is during the reign of Emperor Vespasian. The Romans weren't going to do this and wouldn't be driven to it unless through utter exasperation. And so they decided to, because of the assassination of their officials and so on. So, and the constant stirring up and unrest of these Jewish activists, again named assassins. And so this is what led to the Masada thing, where the Jewish activists holed up in this near impregnable fortress called Masada. It was, I think it was originally built by Herod, but it was a masterpiece of self-contained fortress building, where because it was in an quite remote area without a nearby water resources, it was hugely difficult for an invading army or anyone to lay siege to this fortress, and it had its own what would you call it, like water storage facilities and various other grain storage facilities. It's very well put together, and so the Jewish activists headed off to there when the Romans decided to go after them. So they vast engineering resources, huge logistical resources. I mean, you're supplying an army of many thousands of men with water. Just the logistics of transporting enough water there was in itself a huge. So it was a massive undertaking by the Roman army, but they were determined. And there was only, I think there was less than 1,000 activists there, but the Romans were determined, no, we're going to finish this once and for all. And again, they built a ramp up to the fortress. Going off a spur in the natural spur in the rock, and eventually these people all committed, I think other than a handful, all committed suicide rather than be captured and either killed or used by the Romans for propaganda purposes. But nonetheless, this is so this area has been a hotbed of drama and dissents and conflicts and assassins and people wielding knives in the night. It seems to be that's how things are done there, and today really is no different from what was happening thousands of years ago when the Romans were there. What a terribly sad episode, yet here we are. You've been with Tassus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.